This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and thank you for joining another show. This week, there's been a lot going on with the catastrophes, the natural catastrophes that seem to keep rolling all over the world, and it does provide this continuous opportunity for us to be aware and compassionate of what's going on with others. And sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. So I do encourage you to take care of yourself and remind you that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So some of the things we're going to be talking about today as it relates to the race and reconciliation journey, it definitely can create tension. And as it creates tension, it's important for us to be aware of how we can manage that. Everyone's going to have their own way of dealing with the tension. So as we move forward, I do encourage you to make sure that as you listen to really any of the shows or anything that you're reading or watching or listening to, that you take the opportunity to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So welcome to the One Human Nation show. My name is Sandy Batiste. I'm your host. I just realized I needed to back up a little bit just to make sure that I wasn't coming through clearly. The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. And as I was saying, keep in mind that a lot's been going on, whether you follow politics for the United States or whether you've been looking at globally what's been going on. In the Savannah area, we just came through Tropical Storm Irma, as well as for other parts of Georgia. They got even a larger impact from the Hurricane Irma, and it just keeps flowing and flowing with the earthquakes and natural disasters that seem to be happening all over the world. So it's a time that it's very important that you take care of yourself. And the topic that we're going to be talking about today, as we talk about on most Thursdays, it can be one that does create tension. And remember, one of our general communication agreements from the One Human Race workshops is that the tension, the divine can be found in the tension. Again, the divine can be found in the tension. The problem that we typically run into is that I had to really learn about, and so maybe this will help you as you go through your journey. It's very difficult in going through a reconciliation process. Number one, it doesn't end. Just once you are aware of what needs to happen for race reconciliation, or to be more aware of the different cultures and the subcultures and the messages that we send, I wish I could tell you that, okay, once you get it, you're done. You don't have to do anything else. Everything's taken care of. All's right in your world. You can go on your way and not ever have to think about it again. Unfortunately, that's not how it works with the reconciliation process. And the first part of the reconciliation process is typically one of the hardest, and that is taking a look at the truth. And what is that truth? And what did you hear growing up? What stories were you told? Or even if you weren't told stories, what was What was the message within the silence? What were the things that you read between the lines? So when the guest today, we do have a guest on the show that will be calling in, and about 5 or 6 minutes or so. The guest today is really going to be sharing some insights on his journey and how it progressed from growing up to what he describes as a progressive environment to this journey of where it's led him to today. And one of the things that resonated as I talked to Brian as part of our pre-interview chat is this really is going to get into the importance of your internal journey. And this is not something that anyone can do for you. It's really taking a look at the concepts that we've posted on the One Human Nation website, onehumannation.info. Take a look at that website and that cultural iceberg. And this is where it really, when we talk about the deep culture, it's how are things happening that you start to notice not only the reactions of others, tone of voice and attitudes and concepts of fairness and justice, but also start taking a look at how are you internalizing this experience. And it could be as simple as an experience I've mentioned before, going to the grocery store, or maybe you're calling vendors for an event, or maybe you need some work done on your home and you're trying to get service for that. What are some of the things that you have to do in order to and I don't want to use the word fit in, but that's what we feel like. That's what the tension is. Many times, especially when you're a person of color, is okay, am I doing anything that's going to create a problem? Is it going to create a disconnect? So this week was a week for me to get work done on the property, and it required working with other vendors, an electrician and the electric company, and it's all about how do those interactions happen. And I'm very conscious of tone of voice when you're talking to people, and that tone of voice especially becomes critical for me when it's then face to face, because I'm very sensitive to saying something or projecting something that someone is going to take offense to, because maybe they have a bias, they have a prejudice, or they may be just plain racist. And am I going to trigger something that's going to require me to make some adjustments? Maybe that's I pick a different electrician to work with, or I pick, what do you do though when that municipality is the municipality? I do like to watch, and I would encourage you to do this in your community too, because I think most communities have their city council meetings that are televised. I encourage you to watch those meetings. And I really like it in Savannah. It's very easy to access the city council meetings. It's very easy to access the school board meetings and the Chatham County meetings. And if we're going to be aware and awake of what's going on in our community, we have to tune in. And you may say, well, I don't want to hear it, Sandy. It's just politics. But a lot of this type of exposure really lets you start learning more about the community that you live in. And it's something that I've been very intentional about for moving back to Savannah, because there's one thing to visit a city, and this is where I was born and raised. But then it's another to come back as an adult and live in the city, especially when your awareness has been, you're awake. You're awake as a human being. You're awake to racial inequality. You're awake to economic inequality. You're awake. And so what happens when you're trying to manage that. So I encourage you to take a look around your community, see what's going on. Is there a group that you can join that's already on this journey? And it may be a book reading group. It may be something that you Google and find as far as events in your area. It's really easy to get plugged in. And I hear the caller calling in now, so I'm going to take that call and let you listen to some music.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Brian, as we get started talking today and chatting today, let's kind of start with the basics. Kind of, I call it the beginning years of where you grew up and what that experience was about, and just kind of your household environment.
Sure. Well, today I'm a civil rights attorney in Austin, Texas, but I grew up in a relatively small town in Indiana. I was born in '84. Grew up in a place with about 60,000 people. My folks were not native Hoosiers. They were both kind of transplants to the area, brought there by jobs at Indiana State. And I lived in Terre Haute until I graduated from Indiana State. And when I was about 21, I moved to Indianapolis and started law school.
Okay. So when you grew up when you started like first grade, second grade, and I like to refer to cultural mix. I'm getting so negative and burnout on the word race since it's something that's been created. But what was the diversity, if any, when you were growing up?
Well, when I was very young, from preschool to about second grade, I went to a grade school that was on the Indiana State campus.
Okay.
And I don't recall exactly what the story was about why that was created, but it was a neat mix, both because of the attendance zone and because like a lot of the professors' children or faculty's children went there, and also some of the students, children of international students. So it was an interesting mix, for small town Indiana. And then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just going to ask you, when you say small town Indiana, give us an idea about the demographics then, and what year, what kind of time frame are we talking about?
Well, Indiana in general is pretty white outside of the major cities. Looking back, it's and pretty segregated too. I was born in '84, and so I started kindergarten in '89, I think. Right, kind of, I think in probably the beginning of the Rust Belt years.
Okay. And so one of the things you mentioned to me that there was a news story on CNN that you first heard the use of the N-word, and tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a strange story looking back, I guess. But I mean, I grew up in a very liberal household, even though the city was kind of a blue dot in the very conservative red sea of Indiana. And I have a very clear memory about being around 8 years old. I mean, I think it was around the time of the Rodney King beating. I don't recall if it was before or after.
Okay.
And there was a news report that police officers in Los Angeles had referred to the mayor there, by the N-word.
Okay.
And, the memory stands out to me because I had not heard that before. I literally had no idea what that was about, and I asked my folks about that. And they were kind of shocked that was my first exposure to it. So, looking back, I'm not exactly sure how it unfolded that I was so insulated from that sort of discussion, up until the time I was 8 or 9. But there it is.
Yeah, and that's really not unusual. I mean, it's really, that's why we talk about, what kind of environment growing up, because, there might have not been any exposure whatsoever, and there's no good or bad or right or wrong. It's being aware, of when was the first time that we, and it's going to vary depending on the experience of when we became aware of this thing called race. And so I don't remember us talking any specifics about like high school, any high school experiences. And I don't know if there was anything that's triggered from the time we initially talked, but I do want to talk about your undergrad experience. As far as what are some of the things that when you initially went to undergrad school that you were thinking about doing, and how did your internship kind of change your thoughts? Because we really want to talk about that, because that is connected to one of the main institutions that we still have a huge problem with, systematic racism.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, looking back, it's kind of hard to believe how, naive I must have been, growing up. On one hand, it's pretty obvious. There's a pretty clear message in the world about intentional discrimination and, knowingly treating someone else differently as being wrong. Like, just with my parents and with, like, even just movies and television, it's pretty clear that using the N-word and treating someone else differently was kind of what the bad guys did.
Right.
But in terms of like white privilege and institutional racism, I really was, I think, largely oblivious to that until college. When I went into undergrad, I majored in criminology, and I graduated with a criminology degree because when I went in, I had the ambition to join law enforcement in some capacity.
Okay.
That seemed like the way to make a difference and to help people out and kind of have a meaningful life. And, along the way, one of the things that I did in college was I did an internship with the Terre Haute Police Department, and that involved 200 hours of ride-alongs in the course of one summer. So that was a lot of time, sitting
Right.
co-pilot in a police cruiser. And it was shocking to me, and I think that was the thing that really turned me off that entire path. There isn't a very large African American population in my hometown, and none of the officers, as I recall, used any racial epithets.
Right.
But I mean, it's pretty clear in their language in general, and in the way that they conducted themselves when interacting with folks who are African American, and also the Hispanic population in my hometown is negligible, or at least it was. I have no idea what it's like today. They just treated people vastly differently. They spoke about them differently. They thought about them differently. I'm not even sure I've got the right terminology for it exactly, but I mean, when the police would talk about an individual who was a white person, that was a person with a bundle of, history and circumstances and beliefs and background, all the things that go into, your personality and where you are on that given day. Maybe they were having a bad day or whatever.
Right.
Whereas dealing with, responding to calls with African American folks or stopping them in their cars, more often than not, it was very much, treating those folks as the other and in a very negative way. When I say I'm not sure I've got the terminology, it's just kind of this general, like one person is almost interchangeable with the next kind of perspective, kind of a dehumanized type perspective on it.
Right.
Which, I mean, it really worked out very poorly for everyone involved. that really turned me off the institution in general. And today, a substantial portion of what I do as a civil rights attorney is actually litigate police misconduct.
Interesting. So let me ask you about that. As far as, of course, when you're in your college days, I can only speak for myself. I was pretty much oblivious to. I mean, even as a Black female, I knew about race. I'd had, parents had the talk. I knew about racism, but there was still this part of me that I just thought, okay, well, I did well in school, and I'm going to college, so those things don't those things impact other people, and they don't impact me. And there was not I didn't see where it was anything that I needed to focus on. And I'm just wondering, as you were going through those ride-alongs, at a very young age, because I mean, even when you're in undergrad school, to me, at least I was not very much awake. I was very much sheltered into the real world. Was there anything that you can remember that you wanted to have a conversation, or that you asked the question, and this is not in a judgment mode at all, Brian, of asking, what was the difference, or why did they, or was it just so obvious in how they treated people of different, different cultures? Was it just such an obvious thing? You're like, you know what, I'm just going to do my internship, and that's going to be that.
The question is, why did I, or why not
did
question the officers about why they were,
especially since it was such a turning point for you? I mean, did it come up with maybe, and I don't even know how involved it was with the college counselors when you said, you know what, this is not the career path that I want to go down. Was there any conversation about the why of that, of what changed your mind as a white male? I mean, what changed your mind that you made a different choice? Or was it just this internal, you know what, this is not going to be for me?
It was more the latter. I don't think I ever had a discussion with folks like that about it. I mean, within the context of actually being with the police, I think I would have been intimidated to have that kind of conversation.
Right.
Because, I mean, I was 19,
right,
maybe 20. And I mean, there was just, even with me being a white dude, I mean, there's a power dynamic there.
Right.
And I didn't even have a joking relationship with them.
They were doing what they needed, what they had to do, what they were told to do. So you were there. So you were not there to change how they were going to do things.
Frankly, I don't think any of them were particularly happy to have interns with them.
Right, exactly. That's where I was trying to go to with that. But I think that speaks, that really does speak to what we talk about on the show, and that is the deep culture. It's the things that are not obvious when you take a look at the cultural iceberg, but it very much gets into how people are treated, the fairness and justice as it relates to class, difference in cultures. And I think a lot of it has to probably also do with tone of voice and in how you talk to someone that you consider to be an equal with you, as opposed to someone that you may talk down to you. So as you continued on your journey and you made the transition into, I guess, at this point, deciding you wanted to go down a different career path, talk to us about what that was like. Was there any standout moment going through law school that you decided, here's what I want to focus on?
There was. At first, when I went to law school, to be perfectly honest, I kind of went impulsively. I'm not sure how many people say that, but I realized kind of towards the end of my career path in undergrad that I didn't want to do law enforcement, and with a degree in criminology, I wasn't really sure what else I could, pursue.
Right.
And so I had taken some classes in law, and it seemed kind of fun, so I went to law school. And at first I thought it was a horrible mistake. I mean, the first year you learn all about property and contracts, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to work for some corporation, and this is going to be terrible. Fortunately, I was able to I had some cool opportunities there. There was one professor in particular who was really inspiring, maybe not surprisingly, because he was the director of the ACLU of Indiana.
Okay.
And, and so it took that exposure for me to and bear in mind, when I went to law school, I hadn't even met any attorneys in my life before I went to law school, so I really didn't know that much about the legal profession. He was the first person that really inspired me to believe that there was something like really and truly good that I could do with my law degree. I mean, money, for instance, is not something that particularly motivates me. I mean, I'm not going to say I don't care about it, but the difference between earning $60,000 a year and whatever, three figures, I mean, it's not terribly motivating. But being able to, actually have an impact on the world, or more pointedly for the story, seeing that was an opportunity, that one person with commitment and, a license to, actually have some positive impact on the world. That was really inspiring to me.
Okay.
And so that was a big deal. And eventually I decided to move to Texas because, I really didn't have any roots in Indiana aside from my folks who, were going to leave when they retired. And so, I ended up turning around and deciding to move to Texas. I figured I'd be going into the belly of the beast, and there'd be plenty of cool stuff to do.
Okay. We're going to take a short break because I do want to talk a little bit about what you observed. I'm looking at my notes in the drug culture as it surrounded, the difference with meth and the just some of your insights on that as far as how the difference would be treated culturally, because there was a shift in the drug culture as far as who was involved in being addicted and the meth labs and all that. So we're going to take a short break, but just hold on, and we're going to be back after I make a few announcements, okay?
The Savannah Children's Choir presents the Best of Duke Ellington's Sacred Concerts. The Best of Duke Ellington's Sacred Concerts combines gospel and jazz. The work utilizes a jazz orchestra, singers, and a tap dancer. The Best of Duke Ellington's Sacred Concerts will be on Sunday, April 30th at 3 p.m. in the Lucas Theater. Tickets are available at www.savannahboxoffice.com.
If you enjoy our programming on WRUULP, please support the station with a donation. As an individual, you can give any amount, become a basic station member, or become a series fan of the station. To check out membership rates and to donate to the station, go to www.wruu.org. www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Again, to donate, go to the station, go to www.wruu.org/individual and select to donate monthly or subscribe to an annual membership. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUULP. And I want to apologize. I did play that PSA for the children's choir, not realizing that was for a past event, but they're still a very good organization if you would also want to find out more information about the children's choir here in Savannah. So we're going to go back to our guest so we can get his insight on more about the criminal justice system and kind of what he sees in his role currently as an attorney there in Austin. So Brian, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, perfect. So as you looked at, and I know you got out of the whole criminal justice. Well, you don't totally ever, I think, get out of it. But what were some of your observations based on the drug, I guess, culture or the drug environment in what you started noticing and maybe the people that were being impacted, I guess, by involvements with drugs? What did you see as a shift from your point of view from the legal side of the system?
Well, Do you mean in Indiana or in Texas?
If that experience was in Indiana, because I think that I don't want to make generalizations, but I think that would be probably just kind of a little snapshot of what was happening in parts of the other parts of the country, that the demographics were, there was a higher percentage of white people there. There was definitely a shift in some of the involvement in the drug culture.
Sure. Well, I mean, when I was growing up in Indiana, I mean, when I was a young adult, in high school through college, the phenomenon of methamphetamine cooking became a very big and real thing. At the time that I was in college, the county that I was living in was among the top 3 in the country for arrests for methamphetamine. And it's interesting, kind of the class dimension that went into that. I'm not as familiar with how that unfolded as I am with some of the things now in my professional life as an attorney.
Okay.
But definitely the public perception was that it was very much associated with folks who were poor, and in Indiana there are always jokes about like Kentucky and the poverty in Kentucky, and
okay.
The two seem to go very hand in hand.
Okay.
It's very, very much, objectifying folks and a lack of sympathy and treating them almost as like it was an endemic, like the people involved were.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit then about what you're doing currently, and what organization that you're involved in, and some of the things that you are, that you have seen experience-wise, and how that's shaping your involvement in this, I guess, for want of a better description, this social justice work that you're doing.
Sure. So, I mean, right now, earlier this year, I helped found a nonprofit organization called the Austin Community Law Center. Before that, I mean, I've been in Austin for over 8 years now. I've had my license that long. I've been doing civil rights work that long. A lot of it was with a different nonprofit, and the focus of my work, about 80% of it, was filing lawsuits with respect to the way people were being treated in jails and in prisons here in Texas.
Okay.
And I mean, if you needed a lesson in racism and in disparities in criminal justice, taking a stroll into a prison is a pretty quick lesson in one. So I could go on about that, but I mean, I did that for several years.
Give us one example of that. When you say you walk in, you can immediately see. What's one thing that stands out?
Oh man. Well, I mean, the conviction rates, both the rate of conviction and the length of conviction in Texas, are really hugely skewed against African American folks. I think that, I mean, just the incarceration rate is overall statewide is twice the level of the representation of African American prisoners in the prison system is twice the percentage of the statewide population of African American residents.
Okay.
Whereas with Anglos, it's at about 50% of the statewide representation. So I mean, it's a very high percentage of Black people in prison.
Okay.
Predominantly for low-level offenses, people going in, 50% who go in are going in for 2 years or less. A lot of convictions for minor drug charges. And the prisons, when you approach most of them, it's not an exaggeration to say that they're very reminiscent in, at least outwardly, of, I don't want to oversell it, but they have a lot of features that are very similar to what you would have seen, like with a plantation.
Right.
Because many of them historically have that lineage.
Right.
Some of Texas's oldest prisons were, at one time, plantations that were purchased by the state, like in the late 19th century.
Okay.
And just a lot of the systems of having inmates like on a chain gang, doing work around in the fields, a lot of the agricultural features. I mean, it's very much like going back in a time machine when you drive up to a prison, and it's very creepy and kind of scary to see.
Okay.
Even within the prison, there's this whole strata of folks who are trustees or, given that status because they're not deemed to be a security risk, usually because they have super short sentences and have no interest in receiving another sentence for misconduct.
Right.
And they just do all sorts of service and janitorial work around the prison. And there are a lot of black people involved. Actually, there was one time where me and a couple of students got locked into an interview room, and the locksmiths who came to bust open the door and set us free were inmate laborers. One time I was leaving a prison, and the door on the front gate was just wide open.
Okay.
And I was like, well, that's weird. I don't know what's up with this. That might not be good. The lock on the door was broken, and they had an inmate working on it to fix it.
Okay.
It's just very surreal.
Right.
So, the fact that kind of parallel world exists in the middle of Texas, which, is obviously very conservative and has a lot of issues, but still supposed to be the 21st century, is a shocking wake-up call. And I always but I thought it was important to, when I had the opportunity to take students out there with me and be like, look at what's really happening,
right.
an hour away from where you live. So anyway, those years were a pretty thorough lesson, I think. And at the same time, there are a lot of smaller things. I've done, my legal work has really exposed me to an awful lot. I've done a lot of pro bono work around evictions, for instance, or at least with regard to policy in schools.
Right.
And there's, in Austin, there's a ton of, it's one of the most economically segregated major metros in the country.
Yes, it is.
At least a couple of years ago, it was at the top.
So you piqued my interest, Brian, when you mentioned, when you said evictions, because for some reason I was thinking evictions out of property, but are you talking about school suspensions and evictions, public schools?
Well, I was talking of taking apartment eviction cases,
okay.
But
okay.
out of classroom discipline, which is the term that's often used, which is like out of class suspension all the way through expulsion.
Right.
There are very solid stats that not only are children of color, especially black children, disproportionately subject to that discipline, but it actually goes up at a higher rate when you go to the handful of schools that have a relatively high concentration of African American students. It's pretty bad, and I don't know that the school system has any sort of logical explanation for why that's happening.
Yeah, I think the shocking thing for me is when I became aware of it's referred to as the school to prison pipeline, and that it was actually the third grade literacy level that was kind of the projection used for how many prisons needed to be built. And when I heard that, I just was appalled because, you hear some things about, get to junior high school, that's when kids drop out, but they're actually being pegged at a very young age, and there's something that's just not right with that. and so we have had previous guests that spoke about his experience even as a teacher, as an African American teacher, as well as a student growing up, and what the expectation was for him not really to be a very smart child, for him not to be able to do math problems and to exceed and succeed in this actual schoolwork. So yeah, that's a whole nother topic of conversation as far as what can be done with the school system. But I think they are still at the core. I think it's still very much tied to the racism that's in this country. But I want to get back to some of your experiences in what you're doing, in the work that you're doing now. What's driving you? What are you seeing as some of the driving forces that you're passionate about?
Sure. So I recently helped start a nonprofit called the Austin Community Law Center, and it has a mission with 3 main points. The first is to try to make legal fees cheaper. The second is to invest in the community, time and knowledge. And the third is to fight for justice, which mostly means impact litigation and advocacy that is targeted at institutions that are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. It's difficult, in trying to map a route to a better future to begin to isolate, where the causal mechanisms are to have a change. And also within that, trying to decouple or not decouple, but just to understand the interrelationship between racism and classism. And of course, frankly, patriarchy is a huge part of it. That should be part of the discussion too. A big part of the nonprofit organization's work, first of all, is just to make legal fees cheaper, and that's commonly access to justice. There are a lot of ways where people are forced, you have no choice but to be involved in the legal system, just because we've structured society that way, whether it's you're talking about divorce and child support and things like that, or if you're talking about the criminal justice system or an eviction or foreclosure, you don't get the option of walking away from that.
Right.
And we don't, especially for civil matters, the appointment of counsel in criminal matters is a big problem, but we don't even have a pretense of helping people out for most civil cases. So a really big part of what we do is we structure things at the nonprofit where we still charge a fee, but it's vastly below market rates and charged on a sliding scale based on a person's income.
Right.
So it's just trying to make access to justice more accessible. There's the impact part. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just had a question when you said civil cases. So does this also have an impact with people that are not able to pay, tickets and being sent to jail because they are not able to pay fines?
Yeah. That's one of many big examples where not being able to afford legal counsel is a problem. I do both civil and criminal defense type work.
Okay.
But yeah, tickets are an example where oftentimes it becomes more cost effective for people to represent themselves with coaching and advice.
Okay.
Unless they, for whatever reason, feel really compelled to retain an attorney.
Okay.
That's absolutely an issue, and that's something that we've been working on as a policy basis in the city of Austin too. Because it's unconstitutional to put someone in jail for not paying a fine on a fine-only offense, unless you hit this really narrow zone where you can show that they are intentionally refusing to pay it just because they don't want to and not because they don't have the means to. And so that's been an issue all across the state of Texas because a lot of cities, a lot of the problem with the criminal justice system is you develop this fast track. And I think the most charitable way to look at it is just indifference compounded by a need for expediency, where, they just put people down these chutes very quickly with very little analysis. And this is one example. Lots of folks who can't afford to pay a fine because, Austin is a very expensive place to live.
Right.
And if it's a choice between paying your rent or buying food or paying a fine, I think people are mostly going to go with their rent or the food.
Right.
Or medicine or whatever it is. The court the courts end up paying people with a very broad brush, and a lot of folks end up getting, days in jail for fines that, in truth, they can't afford, and so constitutionally we shouldn't be incarcerating them.
Right.
So that has been a challenge, and it's a big issue. Of course, when people are thrown in jail for a period of days,
they can't.
It's very easy to lose the job.
Exactly.
Yeah, and who's supposed to take care of their kids while they're in jail? Sometimes they've got someone to help out. Sometimes they don't.
Right.
They lose their job. It's most people are month to month. Well, not month to month, but kind of hand to mouth when it comes to paying for their rent. So it becomes a downward spiral very quickly. It doesn't take much. There are a lot of different points on the road, whether it's tickets or whether it's one missed rent payment or any number of things. It doesn't take much to tip people over the edge into a downward spiral.
Right.
They can include all of those things, really.
Okay. So give us a look at your day. What kind of in the day to day? Because I know, it's kind of the daily minutia of things that you have to work through. But how does your day typically flow as far as how do you identify what's going to be the focus and what's going to be the plan for your nonprofit organization?
Oh well. pretty much every day of my life is a headlong race forward. I've got a couple of afternoons set aside when I meet with new potential clients who come to me with all sorts of stuff. About half the time I give them advice, and that's all I can do, and hopefully often they seem happy with that, and sometimes they're interested in hiring me. So I work on those cases. I've also got cases that I've taken on, without charging clients. Mostly I've got, cases against police officers here in Austin, and I think it's important to work on those because they're a toehold to trying to change that institution. Okay. I also have wrongful death cases and that sort of thing from time to time, different parts of Central Texas.
So let me ask a question, because one of the things
Sure.
when you mentioned about the, kind of making that change in the culture within the in the police system, because I do think there's a culture that exists there that really dates back to slavery and this whole attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Is it about changing the culture? Is it about changing policies and procedures? I mean, do you see that there is an understanding that, my expectation of when I get stopped by a police officer may not be quite the same as someone else? That doesn't mean that I should not be, abiding by the rules, but there is a different. I don't think that there's any person that wants to get stopped by a police officer, and it's a tough job. I mean, it's a tough. I do want to say that in all defense. I mean, it is very difficult to determine when you're going to be in a situation that can cause you harm. But is the attention on training, or it's just, okay, let's figure out what to do just to get this particular case done? I mean, is there a way to get to the deeper source of how do we start making a change in that particular culture?
I think it's a tough nut to crack because there are different components to it, in my estimation. One of it's definitely a legacy of racism in these institutions, which may have become worse with the war on drugs and the process of militarizing police departments. And I think it's definitely exacerbated by the fact that for a number of reasons, they end up being super insular groups of people. Part of it's because of the shifts. I mean, I remember in my hometown, they would have a 4 days on, 4 days off, and then every 6 months or so, they'd be knocked around or moved around from 1 to 3 shifts, whether 6 to 2 or 2 to 10 or 10 to 6. And I mean, I reflected on myself at the time when, 6 months from now, you may be on the midnight shift and you never know when your weekend is because you're 4 on, 4 off. How are you supposed to have friends outside of the police department? I mean, you wouldn't be able to keep any sort of schedule with most folks.
Right.
And in Austin, most members of the police department, or at least a huge proportion of them, don't even live in the city of Austin.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, they commute from outside of the city of Austin. And so that's kind of where it leaves us, where we've got this, really embedded and self-reinforced culture, which has a lot of problems with it, including being racist very frequently. And I'll agree with you. I mean, there are definitely good police officers, and I'd like to hope that the majority of them are, although it's hard to capture data on that. The problem, in my experience, particularly, which is mostly in Austin, is what happens with the bad apples. Because, I mean, there are bad apples in every institution, and when you're talking about the police, the potential harm by a bad apple is so much worse than if you're just talking about an accounting firm or something.
Right.
So what happens with the bad apples? Well, in Austin, nothing happens really. I mean, until they shoot someone, they pretty much fly under the radar, in large part because of a combination of state laws that insulate them from accountability and a police union contract that goes a long way to insulating them from accountability. And so there are folks who basically beat people up every day, not necessarily throwing punches, but it's very frequently, throwing people into the ground, putting a knee in their back of their neck, twisting their arms around. Sometimes it is punches. I've got a case with some jaywalkers who were punched up pretty soundly for the heinous crime of jaywalking.
Wow.
It's a tough nut to crack. I think part of it is the front end. I mean, I think we could definitely do a lot with better training. Right now, there are aspects of training that clearly make the situation worse. I've spoken to police officers who say, well, I've been trained that the moment that I believe I'm going to need to put hands on someone, I need to basically, what phrase am I looking for? Dominate them, take them out, put them in a position where they're completely submissive as fast as possible.
Right.
Because otherwise the situation could escalate. And so what that means is you get into a small verbal altercation with someone and all of a sudden they're throwing them face first to the ground.
Right.
Which, is pretty much the direct opposite of the de-escalation training, which is, by the research institutions, even like the Police Executive Research Forum, regarded as a best practice. It's just a best practice that's being ignored right now because police officers are kind of fall into that technocratic perspective where they believe that they know what's best and that the public and oftentimes even the chief of police and people in the brass don't know that they know better than everyone else. And so internally they have very little interest in pursuing anything that's different. But I think training is a big deal. Accountability on the back end is a really big deal.
Right.
I think people do change their conduct if they know that they'll be held accountable for it, although that's not a perfect solution because, I don't think in general that the criminal justice system does a very good job of shaping people's conduct. I think things on the front end with training and de-escalation training and anti-racism training would probably reap a lot more dividends. But fundamentally right now, in a lot of places, including Austin, we just don't have the political will to do that. If we did, I think that there are a lot of things that we could be doing as a city, as a country, as a culture to improve a lot of those problems. The police are maybe the most noteworthy example of racism in society because, again, when things go wrong, they go really wrong.
Really wrong, right.
Yeah, but they're not the only institution that has suffered from racism.
Right.
I think that there are plenty where that was far more prevalent than it is today. And I think that that's been rolled back because we as a society decided to make that important.
Right.
Whether you're talking about discrimination in housing or discrimination in, public
Right.
facilities or anything. I think it's not perfect. We still see a ton of problems all over the place, but I think we've made progress in many of those areas. And we could easily make the same sort of progress with law enforcement if we chose to.
Right. And on that note, believe it or not, we're coming up to the top of the hour. So time has it's amazing to me how quickly it flies by. But I would like to invite you to come back to the show sometime in the future and just kind of share some more insights. And if you can let our listeners know, what's the best way to contact you for the nonprofit? Is there a website?
Sure. Our website is www.austincommunitylawcenter.org.
Okay. Well, Brian, thank you so much. I know it's a lot to try to grapple with, and I do appreciate that you have taken this path, at least at this point in time where you are on your journey. It's much appreciated. In defense of Austin, unfortunately, I don't think Austin is the only city that's grappling with this problem. I see some of the same type of, does Savannah have the political will to do what needs to be done to manage some of the problems that are institutionalized, whether it's in the whether it's in the criminal justice system or whether it's in our public school systems. One of the hot topics in Savannah is always kind of the crime rate and what's happening in the public schools, at least from my observation of coming back into Savannah. So I don't think Austin is unique in that perspective, but I'm happy that you're there. And as we continue, if you come across anything that you think would be of interest, that I can talk to our listeners about on the One Human Nation show. And I'm also checking out in the Savannah market, do we have nonprofits doing what you're doing to help with the cost of legal fees and trying to really manage keeping someone totally out of the system. So I do appreciate what you do, and thank you for spending the time on the One Human Nation show.
Sure. I really enjoyed it. I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian, and you take care, okay?
You too. Thanks.
Well, we've been listening to Brian share some experiences that really get into some of the core of why it's important that it's hard when you look at a big picture, a big system, which is why we focus a lot on the internal journey. We have to look inside ourselves so we are aware of what our unconscious biases are. Once again, thank you for listening and tuning into the One Human Nation show. Check out some more information on our resource website at onehumannation.info. Thanks for listening, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for the upcoming sound of Sound Limit with Troy Stoner. Have a good week and take care of yourself.